Ujubee is the name of our group, and it's two of us, Karen Sternberg and myself. Uchu means honey in Zulu. I originate from KwaZulu-Natal, and I started Ujubee when I was in KwaZulu-Natal, but I was mostly working for the city of Durban as the urban beekeeper. When I moved to the Cape about 7 years ago, I wanted to look at what was happening with wild bees. Because when you Google bees, you mostly get information about European bees, number one, and there's not a lot of information about bees in the wild. And South Africa is a place where honeybees are indigenous, and so Karen and I started tracking wild bees and looking at all the patterns that exist, and trying to figure out what the status was of their well-being, because one hears about bees, not honeybees, not being in a good state globally. So there isn't any information about our populations of wild bees and what was happening with them. So I'm now going to share my screen from my laptop. This may take a little while, but bear with me. So here goes. So we started our research, as I said, we're into our 7th year now, and our primary research area is in Table Mountain National Park, but it's Cape Point Nature Reserve. So it's 77 square kilometers of pristine fynbos. And it's a very interesting place to be working because we have sea on both sides, and it's a really great place to be studying pollinators, and particularly the bees, because you have this slither of land going out into the sea, and with the ocean around it, and at the other end you have farms. So the farmers on the other side do have a lot of bees and beehives. So in this regard, we can look at the carrying capacity of a pristine fynbos environment, of this type of fynbos. So what that means is we've had to walk the entire space. We haven't completely covered every inch. We try to do this every day. We walk out and find new areas that we haven't been to, but we pretty much covered, I would say, 95% of the reserve. And then we map all the colonies that we find, and we look at the patterns, all sorts of patterns that exist, the direction of their nest entrance, all the behavior that is specific to wild bees, which means we have now understood, well, we continue to understand, because it's an ongoing learning process. We're understanding the patterns that exist in nature. So the big thing to do when starting from scratch is collecting data and seeing what the patterns are, what exist. Because once you discover a common pattern, the extraordinary will always jump out. So if they do something really different, you will notice it really quickly. And we don't wear any kit or anything like that. When I say kit, it's bee suits or veils or covering ourselves. We would like to represent our species as a positive relationship to honeybees. Our relationship as a species to honeybees is very broken because of what we've done to bees agriculturally and what we do to them when we put them in a hive. So for us, it's a very important relationship that we learn their language, which is Karen and I have to learn to hear the sounds that they make, to see when they are accepting us close by, or if they're not really comfortable with us. And if they're not comfortable with us on that day, we will move away and come back on another day. So this is pretty much our office, and we're currently waiting for a permit to get back to work. It's a really nice place to work because our social distancing is fantastic. We don't see anyone. We're very few, we're the only people who have this very special permit that allows us to go anywhere in Cape Point at any time. And it's very important, especially after fires, to see how the bees are reacting. This is pretty much springtime in Cape Point, you can never ever separate honeybees from flowers. Bees are the most important pollinators on our planet, and that's all the category of bees: solitary bees, semi-social, and social bees. So they are important as pollinators because they completely depend on flowers for food. So they eat the nectar and the pollen. And many other pollinators may just sip on nectar to get energy to go and hunt other things, like wasps might sip on nectar, and they might be pollinators, but the most successful pollinators on our planet are the bees, the honeybees, and, as I said, solitary and semi-social bees. So they're very, very important in terms of pollination. Unfortunately, we can no longer use honeybees as an indicator species. What that means is the health of the environment, because beehives can be in the environment, and the environment won't be healthy if they're beehives, because that'll distort the very sensitive pollination networks. The indicator species will then be the solitary bees and the semi-social bees. But honeybees are a keystone species, which means kind of like your computer, they're the default setting. There are many of them working, and they can work in very adverse weather conditions, and they're not the best pollinators. Their success of pollination would probably be about 15% as opposed to 95% pollination success from solitary bees. And that's because they add nectar to the pollen when they collect it. Anyway, proceeding on, this is Karen in one of our other locations. It's the Klein Karoo, and we have about 8 or 9 different biomes that we work in. But as I said, Cape Point is our primary site. But we go and do research in all these different areas to see how the bees are in each different area. It changes quite radically in each different biome. So, of course, we are extremely privileged to live in this beautiful world. It's the richest floral kingdom, most diverse floral kingdom on the planet, and of course the most threatened. And the threat comes from the habitat loss, urbanization, and the big one, agriculture. And so when we took a look at hotspots on our planet, when something is described as a hotspot, it means that 70% of that environment has already been destroyed, and we're one of the hottest hotspots on the planet Earth. So that's very unfortunate, because it's this exquisite environment, and it's very, very, very complex. When you look at bee species, the number of bee species we have in our region, it's over 1,300 species of bees and counting, because there are so many different little species of bees, and we don't have enough taxonomists to identify them, and people working in this area. I'm not a taxonomist, but when you look at the flowers, the richness of the floral kingdom, there will be that amount of, well, not the exact amount of bee species, but there will be a richness of pollinators to match the richness of our floral kingdom. And we have a lot of work to do in terms of insects, understanding insects and knowing their importance in our natural world. As you can see in our world at the moment, it's turned up on its head, and Corinne and I have a saying, the small things matter. And this virus is a very small thing, and it certainly has made us all sit up and look at the world differently. And certainly being locked in the home, we understand what we are missing when we can't access the natural world. So this is the Cape honeybee, Apis mellifera carpensis, and it's a smaller black bee, and there can be quite a number of ranges to its color, but in its truest form, it is a small black bee, and it's not as aggressive, and it's not an easy word to use. Aggressive is a difficult word. I would say assertive, because aggression in bees means they're protecting their babies. So it's not as aggressive as the African honeybee, which is found in the summer rainfall area. And that's the area I grew up in, and so I know Apis mellifera scutellata, the African honeybee, very well as well. So we've been studying this particular honeybee in its pristine environments. And the 3 flowers that you're looking at here are all open flowers of the daisy sort of family. The main one is Syncata vestita, the Cape Snow. So this means if a flower is open like this, it means it's an open invitation to all pollinators. And so the honeybee isn't necessarily the only pollinator visiting these kinds of flowers. But what I want to bring to your attention are the colors, the white and the blue and the yellows. Those are primary colors for bees. And you'll see them a lot in nature, these kinds of combinations. You'll see the daisy down the bottom there is blue and yellow, and it's a perfect enticement for the bees. Bees don't see red, but they'll see red as black, and they see ultraviolet. So you can imagine these colors under ultraviolet, they'll really pop. And bees are always looking for the quality and quantity of nectar in the flowers. They can visually see it through their ultraviolet vision. So ultraviolet vision allows them to see the quantity and the quality of pollen and the quantity and quality of nectar. So honeybees will move from plant to plant, foraging for the best sources. They don't waste their time. They are incredibly efficient when it comes to sourcing their food. They look for that strongest quality, and they send out scouts every day to go and find the best quality of nectar or pollen. And then the dance is the scout will come back and do a dance in the colony, and that tells the bee the location of the nest from the sun and the distance away it has to fly to find its source of food. So here again, some typical colors of flowers that the bees enjoy. And that's the wonderful thing about flowers is every single one of them is an advert. We think flowers are there for our beauty, but actually this is the greatest form of advertising on the planet. They are attracting their pollinators. And the honeybee will fly to, when it's flying out, it visits one type of flower. So if it's going to visit the sororia, it will only go to the sororia to either fetch pollen or nectar. And the reason why it goes to just one flower is it's the nectaries, where the nectar is found, is hidden very deep within the flowers. The flower does that on purpose because it's expensive for the flower to make nectar and pollen, and it wants the bee to work to find it. In other words, walk around and drop pollen off so that fertilization can take place and pollination will then happen. So what happens is the honeybees, they fly to one kind of flower and they figure out where the nectaries are in the first visit. And then they visit another flower of the same kind because they know exactly where the nectary is, and it makes it more efficient for them to go only to one kind of flower on its trip out. So they'll only do the feihi or they'll only do the sororia, and because they want to work it out and go as fast as they can. And that's typical of honeybees in terms of their work ethic. So we also speak about specialist pollination, and honeybees are super generalists, which means they can visit many types of plants. But this particular flower, this only came up, it hadn't been seen in this region for about 50 years, and it came up after a fire, and it's Hessia cinnamomea, and it is only pollinated by honeybees. And you can see the structure of the flower, the anthers touching her face as she goes in looking for the nectary, and it deposits the pollen on her hairs, on her face, and the next time she visits the next flower, she will pollinate that flower. And all the other pollinators that we looked at, this was not happening. So they weren't dispersing the pollen and pollination didn't happen. So they are specialist pollinators for this very rare flower that comes up only after fires. So in this image here, I want to sort of look at the wisdom of honeybees, and maybe look at it in terms of our situation currently. Honeybees are social like humans. we are social too, and we interact with one another, and we touch one another, and we greet each other by shaking hands or hugging a person. And honeybees are touching one another the whole time. So what can we learn from them during this time? Because they're a very old species, and they've been around for about 80 million years on the planet. And their biggest threat to their well-being is bacteria and viruses. And they have worked out how to live in harmony on this planet. And I think this is one of the most incredibly privileged positions to be in, to work with the species. Our work takes us out every day into the natural world, and we observe. That's how we do our research. We observe everything, and we take notes with everything we photograph and we film. So every day we come home and we look at what we've been noting down, or we watch bee movies at night. And what we see is a species that is incredibly aware of the interconnectedness of everything. And so in learning to be like honeybees would be to understand what our role would be as a species on this planet, which I think is really quite useful at this time. The number one thing that this very old species knows is they do not take more than what they need in the wild. A colony only takes the amount of nectar and pollen it needs for its family. There's no such thing as excess honey and pollen in a wild colony. It's only what the family need. And this, unfortunately, is something that we've distorted when we keep them in hives, in boxes. So a wild colony in the wild this is called a nest. It's not a hive, it's a nest. And these creatures are all touching each other. So one has to look at how do they maintain a healthy life within their home space, because they go out into the world and they interact with flowers and other species all the time, and that's the risk of bringing a virus or bacteria back. So if one looks at nest architecture, and I'm just going to show you a couple of nests, you're going to start seeing how varied the nests are, and there'll be a common theme through all these photographs that I'm going to show you. The nest architecture is really beautiful. No one nest is the same, and many of our nests we cannot access, but those that we can, we will see definitely a common occurrence. And the common occurrence is this material, and this is propolis. And propolis is made up of resins that bees have collected from different plants. And now a plant produces resin when it's either injured or it's protecting its buds. And resins are to repel insects. They're antibacterial and antimicrobial. And you can imagine in this very, very vast floral kingdom of ours, the different essential oils that are in those resins. So we've noticed that the bees collect certain resins, and the other important thing about propolis is made up of resins and waxes and pollens sort of mixed together. And there's also soil in there. So you can see this is quite textured as a substance. And it's got a comb look to it, this particular propolis wall, because they've put propolis over a comb. And propolis is super, super important. So here's a honeybee collecting the resins off this Protea repens. Now, this is a very important thing, the job of this particular bee. In a colony, you'll have bees hatching, and they go through different jobs in their lifetimes. But there are one or two bees that have specialist jobs. For example, there's a bee that shapes the comb, and that's a specialist job. And it only does that. And this is another bee that is born genetically to just collect resins. It's a very difficult job because she has to go out there and collect this very sticky stuff. And she's packing, in this image, she's packing, the blue arrow shows the ball of resins that she's been collecting off. She does a zigzag kind of movement with her mandibles, and then she packs it from the front leg, middle leg, onto her little basket on the back. Now, it's super sticky. When she gets back to the colony and back to the nest, she can't take that sticky ball off her hind basket, which is a basket of hairs, especially adapted hairs called the bee basket and the pollen basket. And they catch the pollen, but she uses it to catch the resins. She can't remove this ball of resin easily. She has to wait until a house bee will come and remove it from her. Then it's mixed with all the other ingredients that are required to make propolis. And every single day, the bees will come out and work new resins into this front wall, particularly that main hole that you're looking at. Bees are coming out of that main hole, and it looks quite sort of moist around it, and that's very much the case. Is they put new resins every single day. They work them almost like kneading bread into that black substance, the propolis, and those resins are very, very particularly chosen to act as a disinfectant. So the bees leave and they wipe these resins down on their bodies and their legs, and when they arrive back, they wipe themselves down. So, like, we have to disinfect our hands the whole time, wash your hands with soap. The bees have been doing this for years, but they're using a natural substance. My concern at the moment is the kinds of chemicals that we're using in terms of managing this virus. It might be causing our environment and our own selves some kind of harm as we go on using it more and more. So the bees have worked out the natural substances that are antibacterial and antiviral for themselves. Let me play the video. So watch carefully as the bees come out of that little hole, that you can actually see them wiping themselves down. They wipe their faces, and they're walking over that very moist bit of resin just around that hole there. Some of them wipe themselves down more than others because they've listened to their mother, who said, wash your hands very carefully when you go out into the world. And others don't do it as carefully as the rest. But that's typical, isn't it, of social species. We're all individuals ultimately. So this is a very, very important factor that we need to pay attention to in terms of ourselves as a species, that there are answers to problems that exist in nature, and we need to look very carefully at how older species have survived bacterial and viral challenges throughout their lifetime and their evolution. So this species have chosen resins and essential oils from certain plants to keep themselves from being infected. Now, wild colonies have propolis everywhere. Wherever they have to land, they've got propolis, and it's very, very important for them to maintain it. The other important thing about propolis is it can survive very high temperatures. So the front wall that they have is the first line of defense when they're choosing a nest site in nature. It has to survive fire. This is a region that is fire prone. It's important for the ecology of fynbos to have fire, and so the honeybees have evolved with this region, and so they choose nesting sites that can survive fire, and they use propolis, the choices of resins on the front wall, and they add different chemicals to the propolis, so it can survive temperatures of well over 100 degrees. This is a picture of Karen and I looking underneath this rock after a fire. You can see that the heat of the rock, that white part at the top, has shattered the rock. Huge bits have shattered off this rock. So it was really, really hot. But the colony underneath in that black slither where Karen's wearing the white hat and she's got a torch, the colony has survived. They've had their propolis wall melt a little bit, but the colony has survived. And maybe you've driven past fields of canola and you see a whole row of bees in boxes, and one doesn't think necessarily about natural balance that exists in nature because one's so used to seeing bees and hives all over the show. But there is a natural balance, and it's about 1 colony per square kilometer in pristine environments. And this is very, very important because bees have to share, honeybees have to share their food sources with many, many other pollinators. We have about 400 different types of plants that are pollinated by mice. So you've got mice, birds, lizards, and beetles, flies, wasps, all sorts of other creatures that are pollinators as well. So fire also helps keep the numbers of honeybees in check, and so that there are limited amount of nest sites that can survive fire. This means that only the strongest and the healthiest survive in these regions where fire is important to the ecology of the environment. It's about 1 colony per square kilometer in pristine environments. That's the natural sort of balance of bee colonies. So if one looks at the colony after the fire, some of this propolis wall is it's looking pretty dry. They'll have to put new resins on the outside, but you can see this colony has survived very well. And most of our colonies survive fires. It's well over sort of 90% survival of fires that we've seen. The nest site is an incredible environment. Other creatures will then choose to live there because they too will survive fires. So the red arrow here is pointing to a pseudoscorpion. There are 2 of them there. Pseudoscorpions sometimes are referred to as book scorpions, and they are little arachnids that don't have a sting, and they're pretty blind. They can tell day and night or dark and light, and they live with honeybees because they eat mites and they eat all kinds of eggs that come from the wax moth or the wax moth larvae or the small beetle, hive beetle larvae. They're very important to the honeybees, and their nest site has many, many creatures, very small creatures that live with them because that nest site survives fires. This image shows a colony that was on the move, and they're underneath a concrete table. They're moving from one nest site to the other, and they took with them their pseudoscorpions. The pseudoscorpions clamp to the bee's leg, and they don't hurt the bee when they clamp onto the leg. And every single pseudoscorpion has like a handler that makes sure that they don't drift off. This colony was 3 days underneath this table as they were looking for their new nest site. And the pseudoscorpions got hungry on the 2nd day and started drifting off. And their handler, their bee that was looking after them, would come back, go after them, and usher them back into the colony to say, don't go off, we need you. And when you see them in the wild, in their living with the bees, bees have a feeding site at the bottom of the nest. These creatures need to live in the sort of soil underneath the colonies, and they don't survive in hives. You might see them fleetingly in hives because they move from the bees. They sit on a flower waiting for bees and clamp on the leg, and then they go back to where the bee lives. But if it's in a hive, they have to leave because they can't live in that environment. So they live in the sort of leaf litter and the soil beneath the colonies. This image shows a pseudoscorpion with a wax moth larvae. Now, wax moth are also very important to bees in the wild because if there's any damaged comb, the bees let the wax moth proliferate, and the wax moth then eat out the comb that is damaged. And the bees are constantly maintaining the number of wax moths because typical moths, they lay lots of eggs, and they lay the eggs also in the leaf litter. So the bees pull them out and they walk to the area where the pseudoscorpion's feeding station is, and they drop the eggs, and the pseudoscorpions will then find them and eat them. And sometimes the pseudoscorpions can find the larvae for themselves and eat them. So basically the pseudoscorpion clamps onto that larvae, bites into it, and injects a chemical that liquefies the innards, and then it sucks it out. Scary stuff, insects are. So we often think of bees just in terms of pollination services, but they are such an important food source for many other creatures. Around this particular colony are a whole lot of lizards, and so you've got the black girdle lizard, and they are all hunting the bees. And it's quite an interesting, well, it's super interesting to watch because it's often temperature related. If it's a cool day, the bees can sting the lizards quite easily because the lizards aren't able to move as fast. And this is an image of, we name the lizards as well. There are about 30 or so lizards in this area hunting, and so we give them different names. This is tailless. This particular lizard I could give a whole talk on. He is extremely amusing, and he waits for us to be right up, counting the different kinds of pollen, right up to, we go about 30 centimeters from the colony, and we watch and we calculate things. As soon as we're super close and we're distracting the colony, they're watching us, he will run down and grab a bee off the ball of bees of the colony. And then you have about 50 guards drop off and rush off after him. This is one of the days where he's been stung just above his shoulder, and that bee is stinging him a little bit further down. But he's a real character, and when he's around, we know we have to watch out and be aware that he's going to do something extraordinary. And here he is climbing up onto Karin's shoulder to get a better view of the world around him. There happened to be flying ants that day, and he wanted to see exactly where the best place was. So we've become part of their world. They know us when we come. They'll come and stand on our bags, on the binoculars. They're very interesting characters, and each and every single one of these lizards has a different style of hunting bees, and it's quite remarkable. This is the most interesting character. Another character, my favorite, is the southern rock agama. This is Blue. He's the main male in the area, and he's the dominant of all different lizard types as well. And he likes being filmed. I don't know how he knows it, but whenever my camera comes out, he's right there. He comes right up and he'll come and have a look and see what I'm doing. And he's very interesting because he only eats dead bees. The interesting thing about honeybees, if they're born with any deformity, they do not remain within the family or the colony. They walk straight out and they commit suicide. So you will find every day there might be some dead bees near the colony because some have been born with deformity in their wings, and if they've got any kind of bacteria that they have, they will then walk out. It's a very small number, maybe 2 or 3. And this blue lizard, he comes and eats the dead ones. And what's very interesting is the bees will sting any of the other rock agamas, but he's allowed into this colony. He can walk right in because he also eats wax moth, and they can identify him as an individual character that isn't going to harm them. And he often shows us this. He'll say, look, I can go in here. They don't mind. And he'll go in and eat the wax moth, and he doesn't harm the bees, live bees. This is another character. This is the red-sided skinks. Just above its head, you'll see a guard bee coming to check that it is not going to be a problem for the colony. And this skinks comes in to also eat wax moth, and so it also helps them maintain the numbers of wax moth in the nest site. So this red-sided skink might come through 2 or 3 times in a day just to check to see what's going on. He normally goes right down to the back of the colony and goes right inside there to look for wax moth that might be flying around. And this is an interesting character. This is a 10-spotted running beetle, and they also eat bees. And it's very, very hard for bees to protect themselves from these beetles, because they're basically armor plated. Those aren't wings. They used to fly, but now over the years, the evolution, they don't have wings anymore. So this is a guard bee trying to sting this beetle, but it can't. It can only bite the joints of the beetle and annoy it. It has to be very careful that it doesn't become the food of the beetle. So here is an image of the beetle actually eating a bee, and what we find often in their mating time, a colony will be a very strong source of food, and these beetles are normally solitary, but during mating season, when the males are around, they'll wait for the females to come and eat bees, and then they will mate right in front of the colony while eating bees. They're pretty rude. Here's another creature that eats bees. It's a wasp, Polaris, and it will, these bee wolf wasps, they catch bees while they're out foraging. They take them back to their nests to feed to their larvae. Of course, birds eat bees. The sugar birds wait until the honeybees are filled with nectar before they catch them, because then it's a much sweeter morsel to eat. So you start seeing, if you just sit and observe in nature, you start seeing the patterns. You start seeing, this bird is waiting until the bees have actually finished foraging, and they're flying back to the colony before it feeds on them. This is the leopard toad. Many of the frogs will eat bees as well. The leopard toads are known to come out at night and go and feed on the bees that are guarding the colonies. This is a robber fly. An indicator species are that honeybees are in the area. There are many different kinds of robber flies, and they predate on different insects. So this particular robber fly, if one sees it, one knows that honeybees are in this region. Ujubee has volunteer groups. We have 2, and then we're about to start a 3rd one in the Limpopo area. So we have one on the peninsula, and we have one in the Klein Karoo, where we take people out and we teach them about bees, honeybees, and all the other little wild bees as well. And our volunteer group is called COMB, which stands for Caretakers of Mellifera Bees. And they help us collect data in the region, and Klein Karoo as well. They're helping us with data. And every Sunday, I run a WhatsApp quiz for the 2 groups, and this helps to keep everybody educated about the bees, and they're fun quiz questions that we ask. So education is hugely important, because when you're building a new paradigm, which is what we have to do in this world now. The old paradigm is keeping bees in boxes and exploiting bees, and that's led to a really broken relationship with bees. So we had to go back to understanding bees in the wild, and that's what Karen and I have been doing for the past 7 years. And you then have to educate people with this new information. And so educating through our comb group, and these are the junior rangers and the mini rangers of Cape Town, and we take them out in Cape Point and show them some of the nests and show them all the little bee interactions that exist, and so that people get an understanding of the species as a wild indigenous animal, which it is, not through the agricultural narrative, but through their true narrative, which is they are a wild indigenous animal. This is a group in the Klein Karoo, working jobs for carbon, that do the speckworm projects. I've done a number of talks to these groups in the Klein Karoo. And of course, it's super important for us to work with conservation bodies. And so working with Cape Nature, this is Karen, in one of the small reserves, Cape Nature reserves, which is not open to the public. It's a special reserve for the white dicer, and of course that is pollinated by one of our small carpenter bees. And so we went up there for a day to educate the staff what to look for with solitary bees. And our education extends also in terms of my art, having exhibitions to raise awareness. I think the joy of showing nature in all different ways possible, not just through giving talks, but through celebrating the natural world through my art is a great way of raising awareness, and of course to raise funds for our research. As I said, we're self-funded. The last two images, I just want to destroy two myths about bees, honeybees. That in the wild, baboons go and steal honey from colonies. We've never seen that in any of our areas where we do research, but they certainly do knock over hives and take honey from there, and that's because of it's much easier to do it, and also there's a very different kind of behavior of bees in a hive to bees in the wild. So in the wild, baboons and bees live in harmony with each other. And my next myth that I'd like to fundamentally undo, elephants and bees. There's a lot of talk about these bee fences. I've recently been doing a lot of work around this particular issue because it's not a good idea, the bee fences. So I was recently in Addo Elephant Park to deal with this particular problem, where there was a project that had started to save a tree, a boerbontjie tree, from the elephants. Now, the thing about bees and elephants, they get on fine in nature, absolutely fine. They see each other all the time, and they completely fine. When we start meddling with nature and taking bees and putting them on a fence line, how it normally works is there's a line, a row of bees on a wire in hives, and if the elephant bumps that wire, the bees will then attack the elephant. Now that wouldn't happen in nature. Number one, they wouldn't be living in a hive. Number two, they wouldn't be strung up in the elephant's way. And what happens is the person who's constructed this fence of bees has brought in bees from a different area, and normally these bees are starving because there isn't enough food to support the number of bees that they put in these fence lines. So the bees are very aggressive. But that fence line doesn't work for too long. I've been working with an elephant expert, and it doesn't. The elephants will figure it out after a while. So the bee fence lines and the bee fence to keep elephants out of areas is the wrong thing to be doing. It's pitting one species against another, and it also destroys the sensitive pollination networks. There are too many bees in an area, they will take all the forage from all the other pollinators. And so it's something we really, really need to be very careful about, pitting species against one another. One of the big things we need to do is learn how to live in harmony with creatures. If one looks at the overall picture in South Africa, that most of our honeybees still live in the wild, that's really, really important to understand that factor. We do not have a problem with our honeybees, only in terms of the agricultural sector, where they are not well, because they are unable to use propolis like they do in the wild. And so we are very fortunate to be in that position. So I wouldn't encourage beekeeping at all. I would encouraging a different kind of beekeeping, which would be to support bees in their natural environment. So support conservation areas, and to plant forage for bees. So this is a great time to spend in your gardens looking at what the honeybees are preferring to eat at this time, and just increasing the amount of food that you can. Never, ever, ever use chemicals in your gardens. That has such a profound effect on all insects and birds. So it's very, very important to know that we don't need beekeepers to keep our population of wild bees healthy. So I would define beekeeping now as a person who provides food for bees. I would probably say that there is a pesticide problem. The problem with neonicotinoidal pesticides, and this is something we all can pay attention to, is it's a systemic poison. That means it's in the vascular system of plants. And so pollen and nectar becomes toxic to all the pollinators. If you buy seed, you must buy organic seed if you're planting in your gardens. Many of the seeds that you buy have been pre-treated with neonicotinoidal poisons. So they put them on the seed. You don't know that. You plant your seed. Your first watering of that seed area releases the seed into the soil. It kills all the microorganisms around the plant, and then it gets drawn up into the rootlets. And it is, as I said, systemic. It then is in the vascular system of that plant, and then the whole plant is toxic to pollinators. It is a huge problem, and many of the nurseries don't even know that their seed have been pre-treated. But it's a question you need to ask, or just go for organic seed. It's safer. And people often spray their roses and all sorts of exotic plants with neonicotinoidal poisons. They are extremely problematic. And normally if you find bees that are dead with their proboscises out like that, it's a poison. Well, no, not really, because the interesting thing about wild bees is when they choose to move to a new location, they're finding a new home for themselves. They assess everything that will be in that environment where they choose. So if you a very busy household and you've got dogs and cats walking out and about, the bees have already, if they've come in there, they've already chosen to live with you. They understand that you're going to be busy and thereabouts. So they're very aware of your movements, and they feel quite comfortable to have you in their space and to move in. I think it's a privilege to have a wild colony living with you, and I'm allergic to bee stings, and so I'm very aware of their language, which they speak in sounds. Bees are deaf, but they feel the vibrations. So if you understand when they are feeling uncomfortable, that pitch sound goes higher, then you must just give them a little bit of space. Something might be eating them, there might be lizards having a good go at them that day. But generally speaking, it's an unfounded fear, because the fact that bees have chosen to live with you, they've chosen to live with us. They're a species that knows about interconnectedness, and they know that we're part of this planet, and they know that they have to live with us. It would be foolish of them to attack us, because that would mean that we would attack them back. And also every time they attack a mammal, they lose their life. So they live in harmony with us until we start fiddling with them and meddling with them. The moment you kill a single bee, the entire colony will recognize you as a threat. So it's very important as a human species that we learn to be peaceful with bees. And it's very important in terms of our education, is to somehow unhinge that fear. The Cape honeybee is the most unique honeybee in the world, in that she can requeen. What that means is all honeybees can lay eggs that are unfertilized, and haploid eggs, as they're called. But the Cape honeybee can lay diploid eggs, which means fed the right food, royal jelly, and they can create a new queen. So worker bees can all lay, that they lay haploid eggs, that the Cape honeybee can lay diploid eggs, which means she can requeen. So the colony can requeen if they lose their queen. Normally, if other bee colonies lose their queen, that colony will die out, but not the Cape honeybee. That's a special adaptation to our strong winds and weather conditions here.